profound and wondrous Dharma is rarely encountered, even in 100 million kalpas. Having it you hear, accept and maintain. May I taste the truth of the Tathagata's words. Good morning. Just a little. We're trying an experiment, so we have two computers going. So if it gets choppy, let me know and we can go back to just one computer. But this way I can see the gallery while we're talking, which is nice. The way we usually do it actually is that we have like somebody gets frozen in this large screen, could be any one of you. And then I could just see the little tiles at the top and I scroll through them as I'm giving a talk, but it gets kind of awkward. So welcome. I'm just looking through to see who's here. Looks like everybody. I don't see anyone new, but if you're new and I'm missing you to Stone Creek. Prue, I don't know if you've been here on a Sunday. So welcome to the Sunday morning at Stone Creek, and welcome to everyone else. My name is Dojin or Sarah. Either's okay. I use the pronouns she and her, and I'm one of the head priests at Stone Creek. This week I wanted to, I'm talking about, so this is the first of the 4 Sunday talks that will focus on the topic of our practice period intensive or ongo that spans 5 weeks. So there's a group of us within the Sangha that are meeting on Wednesday evenings to talk about the Eightfold Path. And then this talk and the next 3 Sundays will focus on the Eightfold Path as well. And this is an annual practice intensive that we do each year as a way to come together. And for sure it's modified by being virtual this year, but it's still just really lovely to have a way to come together as a Sangha and take up this. This is a very foundational and traditional teaching in Buddhism that far predates Zen even, and is really a root practice for all schools of Buddhism. The 4 Noble Truths, the 4th of which is the Eightfold Path. Before I begin, though, I wanted to just take a few minutes to continue in a way or add on to what Jisho had brought last week. She was talking about somewhat about the book, Be the Refuge, and the experience of Asian American Buddhists in the United States. And I wanted to just, I'm sure it seems to me like the mainstream news is covering this pretty thoroughly, so it's probably not news to anyone here. But I did want to bring our collective attention and our Sanghic mind to an acknowledgement of the increase of violence against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in the United States, particularly. This is this phenomenon that's, I mean, it's interesting because in terms of like legal documentation and things being reported, there is like 100-fold increase percentage-wise of hate crimes against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. And it also brings to light that racism also in this country has always targeted Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. Some of the worst violence and racial violence in the country, one of the worst lynchings on record was against Chinese Americans in California. So there's this way that, like many things over the past couple of years, there's an intensification of something that brings to light something that's always been there, which is racism against Asian Americans. And I just, for those who maybe haven't heard much about this recent increase, just wanting to, again, like bring our collective awareness to that. If there are people in your life who are Asian American and Pacific Islander, you know, people are having a variety of responses to it, but it's good to consider the possibility that many people in my life who are in that racial category are feeling a lot of legitimate fear. There's been a lot of violence, particularly against elders, so older people. Several people have died. I read a story about a woman a younger woman who was with her baby who was spat on in New York City. And the person who was assaulting her cried out, "Chinese virus." We know someone who is Samoan racially and culturally, this was way back at the beginning of the pandemic, who was verbally assaulted at her workplace. She's Samoan, she's not Chinese. And this is all centering around this tremendous bigotry around COVID being called a Chinese virus. I believe President Trump actually also called it like the Kung flu. So using these kind of slangy terms to conflate, a disease with a country, which I think is just, honestly, just incredibly ignorant. Like, it's just like, there's no really other way to describe that. It's really an ignorant vantage point. It's an ignorant way to view something. Diseases don't have nationality. Even if they did, a whole country of people are not responsible for a disease. I mean, all of it just doesn't make sense. So I wanted to offer a resource that gives more information that was passed on to me it's a pretty comprehensive website that has both news stories about it, ways to be involved, ways to support people, and tracking the numbers. And because most of us, I think most people here are in California. Asian Americans have a long history in this state and make up large portions of our community in Sonoma County. And we do need to be aware, and we do need to be, showing up for the folks in our lives who are, if you aren't familiar with the letters, AAPI is Asian American Pacific Islander. Because our son is Pacific Islander, well, not because of that actually, but in part lately I've been looking at him and I've been trying to think of like, what is it that brings someone to do that? And thinking of this story with our friend who was verbally assaulted at work, who was Samoan. And I was trying to feel into, I was trying to kind of ground myself in compassion and feel into what is the experience that makes somebody do something like that. And I don't know actually, but some of what I could imagine was that, the incident that we know of was from a year ago, before things were even locked down. So early March last year, there was a lot of fear starting to spread around. There's a lot of fear being generated. There's a lot of unknown. And all I could come to was like, somehow this act of violence and attack against another person must have made this person feel momentarily, the perpetrator, some amount of agency or power or empowerment. That's all I could come up with. That like in the face of something scary and unknown, they got super reductive and decided all Asian people are responsible for this. And now I'm going to take it out on this one particular person who's just trying to do her job. And what it brought to my mind was, I don't know if that's what's going on for people. I really don't. I find this extremely hard to relate to. But I think what it did bring to mind is that anytime we try to solve our pain and our suffering, and being in a state of fear and confusion is a very particular kind of suffering, with an oversimplification, like something so reductive as like, I'm just going to lash out at everyone who's Asian American. That's a path of suffering. That's a path of perpetuating suffering in the world, And I was in my mind, or in my heart really, what came to balance, like what the opposite of that is, the possibility for an inquiry, instead of when there's fear and confusion, instead of leaping to I know and that person and blame, our practice supports us to open to inquiry into the pain we're feeling with our confusion, inquiry into the pain we're feeling with our fear, inquiry into the complexity of causation of something like a international virus. And so that actually brings me to the Four Noble Truths, which exists to address suffering, really, or the Buddha taught them so that we have a way to address suffering. And I really, if nothing else, that's one thing I'd like to offer this morning, is that the Eightfold Path, which is the Fourth Noble Truth, is the path of engagement and of inquiry and of relating to the complexity of our lives and the many causes of suffering that we just will encounter being human. Several years ago, we did a practice period on the first noble truth, the noble truth of suffering. And I was thinking this morning, we need to do one on the cause, and we need to do one on the cessation. Just to go over them again, the first noble truth is the noble truth of suffering. The second noble truth is that there is a cause. There is a reason for the suffering. The third noble truth is that there is a path, and traditionally it's rendered of cessation. But I would like to offer there's a path or there's a possibility of interruption of the cycles of suffering. Or to me, that's more helpful because it certainly helps us not feel like we're going to get out of this forever, because we're not. Because suffering is just because of the noble truth, the first noble truth, suffering is part of human life. And then the fourth noble truth is the Eightfold Path. It also can be kind of summed up as the path of practice, or the path of practice engagement. The fourth noble truth and the Eightfold Path is the teaching of like how if we want to not suffer, or we want to reduce suffering in the world, or we want to liberate or interrupt suffering, where in our life can we do that? How do we do that? And that's what I think the Eightfold Path offers us. Just briefly, again, the Eightfold Path is, and there's lots of different renderings, of the Pali and Sanskrit words, but a general one is right view or right understanding is the first. Right intention, resolve, or thought is the second. Right view, right thought, right speech, action, effort, livelihood, mindfulness, and concentration, or samadhi, or meditation. And these eight folds are often grouped into three categories. One category is ethical conduct, so that's speech, action, and livelihood. So how, the precepts are included in here. How we engage in the world. Another grouping is mental discipline, effort, mindfulness, and concentration, or meditation. And the third is the grouping of wisdom, which is the first two, which I'll talk about today, understanding and intention. So in this teaching, we have the Four Noble Truths. The fourth noble truth is the Eightfold Path. And the first grouping within that is the wisdom bundle of skillful, or I would say liberating, understanding, and intention. And just to briefly review for me, I want to just briefly review the Four Noble Truths. When we did that practice period several years ago on the noble truth of suffering, we had one thing that came forward for me was that the Four Noble Truths are not linear, but cyclical. And in that, it actually, for me, over the past couple of years, the Four Noble Truths have really worked like a like a practice instruction, actually. Even though I think Corinne and I have been talking a lot about this, we're teaching on Wednesday nights, and he was talking about this emphasis of like, these are not skills and tools. And I'm like, but it's so useful. So I want to offer, I'm going to offer a tool-like version of the Four Noble Truths today, because I find it so supportive for myself. Part of it was I was thinking, I was giving a lot of thought to, or I was giving a lot of meditation into what is the noble part of the noble truth of suffering. Like, where's the nobility in suffering? And what is alive for me is that dukkha, or the first noble truth, it's not the pain that's the noble part. There's a couple aspects of it that I would say have this nobility to them. The first is it's just an aspect of human life. And more, I feel like, we are human beings, are creatures who love in a sort of unbounded way. For any of us that have loved someone who has died, for example, we can see how our love is not cut off by the finiteness of a human body, for example. So we love in this vast way, but our circumstances are impermanent. And that's a lot of suffering right there. Also, a lot of our suffering comes from we're always trying to make ourselves, we're trying to imagine a view of ourselves where we're cut off and separate and permanent and fixed, like I'm me and I'm going to last forever, or whatever those ideas are. And the truth of reality is we're always changing, and everything's always changing. So that's just a lot of suffering right there. And one of the things I really appreciate about the traditional teachings of dukkha is that sure, there's big and vast pain and suffering and obvious suffering, but there's also just the kind of baseline malaise or discomfort of what it means to be in a human form, to be in an impermanent and extremely sensitive human organ that we are. So to me, the other aspect, so there's like the nobility of like, it's just a fact. We're not going to get out of it. That's why I think the rendering the third noble truth as cessation is a little bit problematic, because that could make us believe we could stop it forever. I feel like as long as we're human, we're going to keep encountering suffering. It might get more subtle, but it's just going to keep happening because it's part of what we are. And the other thing I think is that when we notice that we're suffering, now we're engaged on the path of liberation. And to try to make that distinction is like, how you're, for me anyway, sometimes I'm going along and I'm just upset about something, or I'm just right, or I'm just they're wrong. Like I'm in that field of like something is wrong, and it's somebody else or it's something else. And when in the midst of that like I'm not actually in an awareness of my suffering yet. I'm totally lost in my suffering. But when I get my head a little bit above the water of the suffering, and I'm like, oh, I'm suffering. This idea that I'm right and they're wrong has a whole bunch of painful components to it. Now that's the noble truth of suffering. So it's when we wake up to it, and when we see it, and when we have, ideally, I would say, a tender regard for ourselves in the midst of that. That's the noble truth of suffering, because it's the beginning of the possibility to change the cycle instead of just continuing. And then the second noble truth is that there's a cause. And the cause, the Sanskrit, samudaya. The cause, traditionally, in English, it's rendered as that the cause is craving. In Zen, I feel like we more often talk about grasping or attachment. And I think it's also really important to understand aversion is a kind of grasping. So it has a different gesture of pushing away, but it is essentially a kind of craving. It's a craving for things to be different when we're averting. I was talking with a couple other Dharma siblings over the weekend about the three poisons: greed, hatred, and delusion. And just this, for me, it works like this, that delusion is actually the root poison, always. It's the root of any pain. And then it has these two branches. It either we're going like this towards something and we're grasping toward, and that's greed, or we're pushing away and it's aversion. But the root delusion is that we could be separate at all, you know, that we're apart from things we want, or that we're too close to things we don't want. that comes from the root of believing that we could be separate in the first place. So when we wake up to the discomfort of suffering, subtle or otherwise, for me, how this works as a practice engagement is that then in my heart mind, I now am encouraged to look for the grasping, to look for the craving, to look for the aversion. And I can just say it's been pretty useful as a way to shake up the dynamic of suffering. So if we're going along and we're caught in something and we're kind of lost and clinging to it, then you wake up to the pain of that. That's the first noble truth. And then it's like, okay, so where's the grasping? And it's been, for me, it's really interesting to do that as an exercise, because often the grasping is a lot more subtle than I would have imagined. And usually it has something to do with trying to codify an idea that I'm separate from the world. And then there's the third noble truth, which is there is a way to interrupt this cycle. And what it is the fourth noble truth, which is the Eightfold Path. So there's a whole, to me, this is like, it's a whole, Bhikkhu Bodhi, in one of the readings we sent out to the Anga group, writes that the Four Noble Truths are like an abstraction, or they're the fundamental Dharma, and then the Eightfold Path is how we enact it. But the way it works for me is like the whole thing is that practice engagement. The recognizing of the suffering, the looking for the grasping, and then the knowing that the engagement I can do this process in all these fields of my life. What is my understanding? What is my intention? What is my livelihood? What's the ethical involvement? So there's all those, the Eightfold delineation gives me all this, it's almost like it gives permission, like these are all the fields of our life we're liberating as possible. I think what's also just nice to recognize about the Four Noble Truths is that the Buddha compassionately laid it out in the way that it looks to us as suffering human beings, so that we notice the suffering and then we move on to the craving. Because the truth is actually that the grasping or the clinging is what started it, but it's hard to catch the clinging before there's the pain of its outflows. So the suffering is what's visible to us first, if that makes sense. You know, if it was just describing, if the Buddha just wanted to describe how suffering happens, it's grasping, and now there's suffering, and now there's waking up to it, and da-da-da. But I think there's something really wonderful about saying the suffering's first, because that's what we can see. Now we look for the grasping. So the first fold, so I want to just talk a little bit about the first two folds. The first fold is samaditi, which a lot of times in English is rendered right view. We were talking on Wednesday night about how the word right is, can just be really misleading. Again, especially for those of us that were raised with a lot of dualism and an idea of right and wrong all the time, and getting things right and being right and good, and that there actually the word sama is quite it has a lot more depth to it. And that really ultimately what it's about is, what is the understanding, or what is the view, that's the DT part, that is in alignment with liberation. So for me, the word that's really alive right now is liberating understanding, or liberating view, as opposed to right view. Another one is skillful understanding, or skillful view, aligned understanding, or aligned view. And historically, this is skillful understanding is an understanding of the workings of karma. And that's big. And for me, I think the two major components of that are, first of all, impermanence. So moving around the world with somewhat of an idea that everything is impermanent is a liberating view to have, could be. And also that everything is connected. Traditionally, we use the term, or that term shunyata gets rendered as empty. But then I know I've talked a number of times about how, for me, that it's a better rendering to say connected. Those two pieces, karma works by how everything is always changing and everything's always in relationship. And to have a kind of view of that is can help us be more skillful in the world. It can help reduce our suffering. In the Genjo koan, when Dogen Zenji says, when Dharma does not fill your body and mind, you think it is already sufficient. You think, so that's a view, actually, when Dharma doesn't fill your body and mind, that's a view that, like, oh, I know what's happening here. And it brings me back to the potential mind of the person who was verbally assaulting our friend in the Target. You know, like, I know what's happening here. There's a virus, Chinese people caused it, and it's their fault. And so I'm going to make this person feel my pain about that. That is not the Dharma filling the body and mind. Then Dogen goes on to say, when Dharma fills your body and mind, you understand that something is missing. We understand as practitioners that there's always more happening than our view could possibly see. Things are always more complicated than what our mind can grasp. And again, the offering of this teaching is, and that is a skillful way to engage in the world. It doesn't mean that we don't form opinions or we don't know things. It's just that when we know them with a door open to there being a lot more that we don't know. I mean, even if we just take this and apply it to somebody that we love, you know, if we come at, if we regard a person that we love as something that we can know, just test this out for yourself. Has that caused you pain? You know, because you think, like, well, you're somebody who does this and you don't do that. And then they do the thing you think that they're not going to do. And you're like, no, that's not my idea of you, you know, because people are more complicated than any idea we can have about them. We can even apply this to ourselves, you know, even our own selves. Whatever ideas we have about ourselves, the causations that make us do things in any given moment are vast beyond our knowing. We cannot always know what we're going to do next. And if we get really disturbed by that, we're going to have a lot of suffering. You know? If we can tolerate and stay open to the possibility that there's more stuff going on here than I can account for, then we can ride with the thing that's unpredictable and align ourselves with our values and what we care about. Dogen also talks about, another thing that we offered to the Ango group were these kind of little descriptions by Dogen of each of the Eightfold Paths. And they're fairly trippy. Again, like just to open them. He says, the right view path limb is hiding the body within an eyeball. This being so, the body before this life must embody the eye of the body before, because it magnificently sees the self in the past. It actualizes the fundamental point. It is what has been intimately seen in the past. Those who do not hide the body within an eyeball are not the Buddha ancestors. So in most ways, I'd just like to leave you with that and do what you will. But I'll also offer, when I heard that, I was like, oh, that doesn't seem super obscure to me, actually. To me, maybe because I've been thinking about Skillful View for months and months now. I had this, it was a really beautiful image of the being, the eyeball being maybe a metaphor for perception, that the whole being is inside the realm of perception and is always flavored by so many conditions, including the past. There's all these variables. And that if we think that we can be an eyeball without the whole being in there, I mean, to me, this is actually, so much of my education would be described as objective teaching, and as I was taught, here's an objective truth. This is a teaching like, there is no such thing. Human beings do not see objectively. We see only through the lenses of the many conditions that we hold. There is no such thing as knowing objectively. There is no eyeball attached from the whole being within it. So that's just a start, but you can take that where you want to. And I think maybe most importantly, in terms of like skillful or liberating understanding, is the question that we can ask ourselves, like, what understanding gets me into right alignment with reality? And let ourselves imagine into that. What is the view from which to move in the world that gets me into right relationship or liberating relationship with all things? I heard this quote not long ago. And it said, if all your prayers were answered, would the results benefit the world? And it made me think of right view. If the things that we most wish for and long for could happen, who would be the beneficiary? And to me, that's a way of cultivating right view, of looking at, when I move through my day, when I have a sense of myself, is what I want for the world, or what I want in this world, is it kind of small? Is the impact kind of just for me, or is it benefiting all beings? And how can we come from the vantage point of striving for benefit for all beings? How do we understand ourself, actually? What's the view of the self within skillful understanding? How do we understand our individual selves, including the understanding that something is missing? And the next fold is Sama Sankappa, liberative intention or resolve or thought. I think of this as the fold of practice that's encouraging us to work with the mind ground. And it comes right out of skillful understanding. So we've got like this vastness of skillful understanding. Now, how does that flavor the mind? How does that flavor our intention and our resolve and our kind of our attitude or our engagement, our mind engagement with the world? Traditionally, to cultivate the cultivation of skillful thinking or skillful intention is to actively generate the intention of renunciation, the intention of goodwill, and the intention of harmlessness. And those are meant to counterbalance the kind of natural tendency in samsara of greed, hatred, and delusion. So it's renunciation, goodwill, and harmlessness. I was kind of taking in a whole bunch of different surveys of the Eightfold Path on the internet. And on a site called BuddhaNet, I came across this one by someone named John Allen that I really liked because I thought it was pretty radical. but I really like what he's offering. He translates Sama Sankappa as perfected emotion or aspiration, also translated as right thought or attitude. Liberating emotional intelligence in your life and acting from love and compassion, an informed heart and a feeling mind that are free to practice letting go. Like, that's pretty great. Like, how do we work with the mind to come from the ground of love? I think that's actually what this fold is encouraging us to look at. How do we work with the mind to encourage letting go and not grasping? My teacher, Galen, often talks about this teaching of when we're practicing, we're perfuming the alaya. We're flavoring the mind ground. The alaya in Buddhism is like this idea of like the ground of mind, where all the seeds of conditioning are planted in there. And like whatever the conditioning is, with our practice and our effort, we're actually actively changing that field. You know, this is this fold, I feel like, is very active, and you know, maybe is a little remote for Zen people or people who come to practice through Zen, where there's a lot of like, you know, not trying or not trying to get anything. Like I you know, I love Zen, just want to say for the record. And so I really appreciate that vantage point that really gives us, because if we're just going to take our grasping and apply it to practice, we're just going to generate more suffering. And our practice is effortful. And this fold is saying, work with the mind effortfully, shape it and change it. Greed, hate, and delusion might be what we're naturally conditioned to. And this is saying, work with that. Cultivate mind states that actually counterbalance. And I would say, actually, before I go into that, I want to just read a quote from Bhikkhu Bodhi that I really like. He talks about this fold as a penetrating view of the nature of existence gained through a deep reflection and validated through investigation. It brings with it a restructuring of values, which sets the mind moving toward goals commensurate with a new vision. The application of mind needed to achieve these goals is what's meant by right intention. So, you know, it's a little squirmy for Zen people to having goals and all this stuff, but I want to offer that it's okay for us to be effortful, as long as, maybe this is an important piece, that we do that with tremendous compassion, especially if we were raised in the United States. I feel like I just have never met anyone raised in the United States who naturally regards themselves with compassion. I'm sure there's somebody out there, but I've probably met thousands of people at this point, and I had never met anyone. I feel like the conditioning is so strong. So that's what I wanted to offer, is that, you know, a real life application of this is to consider what the conditioning of our cultures have created and what the qualities of mind look like. Recently, I was talking with a group of people and somebody said, the mind of comparison is so American. And it just really resonated with me. A mind of comparison and of competition and of, you know, constantly labeling status, who's right and who's wrong, and who's up and who's down, and even though things that we do around who's male and who's female, who's Asian and who's white and who's black, and like all of those assessments that we're taught to do by conditioning, many of us in the United States, are actually the mind of comparison, trying to make the hierarchy all the time. And if we take that offering from that teacher John Allen of skillful emotion or aspiration, liberating our emotional intelligence, we can work with, and I would say play with, and try to mess with the conditioning that says that the mind always has to compare. When we see that one arising, we can say, is that the most skillful view I can bring to this situation? Is that the most skillful mind I can bring to this situation? If I bring that mind, is the door open to a whole bunch more beyond my perception, or is it closed? I want to offer just that I think metta meditation is really a super helpful engagement for this cultivation of a liberating mind. And it's neat because it brings up the way that I think a lot of people think of metta meditation as a heart practice, and it is a heart-centered practice, but it brings that wisdom that comes from a number of Asian languages where heart and mind are the same word. And that, I feel like, is its own teaching. Heart and mind are the same. Or what happens when we regard heart and mind as the same. Then metta practice is the cultivation of love and kindness, first for ourselves, then for our loved ones, then for neutral people, then for difficult people, then for everybody. In the Metta Sutta, it's described, just as a mother watches over and protects her only child, so with a boundless mind, not heart, with a boundless mind, one cherishes all living things, suffusing love over the entire world, above, below, and all around without limit. That to me is a description of liberating mind or liberating intention. I think metta practice is like an antidote to all the dehumanizing conditioning we may have received along the way. And it's like a rehumanizing practice. And it's really beneficial in terms of cultivating a skillful way of engaging in the world. One person summed this up. I couldn't find it again, even but in my vast survey of people's views of the Eightfold Path, that this fold is achieved by standing on the ground of the non-exploitation of self and others. I was like, oh, that's pretty good. Maybe we could just sum up like Buddhist engagement in the world like that. The non-exploitation of self and others and all beings. Because we have to be separating and dehumanizing to exploit even ourselves and others. And this is the encouragement to not do that. So I'll just finish by saying that I think it's just another thing to play with, that the Eightfold Path begins with the bundle of the wisdom practices. And it moves on to the mental disciplines and the ethical conduct. And then those feed back into wisdom. And that the Eightfold Path, similar to the Four Noble Truths, is a cyclical, maybe cyclical is like a little too neat, It's like a messy, moving in all directions. Our Zazen practice, which would really, it really could be everything of the Eightfold Path, but would most obviously fit into the cultivation of concentration or samadhi, then feeds back into right and skillful view, skillful understanding. It feeds back into the skillful relationship with the mind ground that allows us to engage in the world with great compassion. So thank you very much for being here this morning, for your practice, for your engagement. That was a little longer, but please bring your thoughts and comments or reflections. How is liberating understanding and liberating intention for you?
Dojin, thank you.
Welcome.
I really love knowing things with a door open, and I'm gonna sit with that. So thank you for that offering.
I heard do you remember the Pessoa quote? I think there's a poet named Fernando Pessoa, who's a Portuguese poet, and I think it was from my horoscope from Rod Bresney this week. It was something like, Charlie wrote it down. He said something like I spend all of my time trying to make doors in walls with no doors. Like that. Looking for doors in walls with no doors. And it just seems so resonant to practice for me. Look for the doors where you think there aren't any, where we've been told that there aren't any. Any other thoughts or reflections?
Dojin?
Yes, I do.
Thank you very much. What would you say, one of the most helpful things that's happened to me during a session was sort of this understanding that everybody there, every cushion in the room, there was a universe. And that one of the issues that I was grasping with was that all I could see was my own little universe. And that to understand that that was happening with everybody, every single person in the room. There was this sort of like, I'm doing this thing over my hands, but this sense of swirling environment of our own upbringing, our culture, our inheritance, our families, our friends, all that stuff. So what would you say about the intersection of perspectives that, when you're talking about keeping a door open, that it's almost like, okay, and it's not my fault. I'm not a bad person because I have this universe. It's just my human, it's the way I am.
Yeah, it's the way everyone is.
Right. So understanding that everybody has that, the beauty, one of the beauties of going forward is that I can hear their perspective, that they, in sharing their universe and being present while it's going on, that's a little more that can be added to mine, or that's something new that can refresh or interrupt. I just was curious about your take on that.
Yeah, it's so great. That's what I think Dogen's describing. When Dharma fills your whole body and mind, you understand that something is missing. So you understand, and he goes on in the Genjo Koan to talk about the circle of water, right? You understand that the whole world is not the circle of water. It's just that that's a limit of your perception. But you're really open to that's a circle of water within a vast ocean. I think and I know that Charlie and I both talked about this, that our one of our teachers, Reb, would talk about, so that when a whale comes through, you're not like, you don't exist. you can't fit in here, And that's a beautiful image, I think. So then what you're talking about, Jude, is so you've got a vast, unknowable, universe called Jude, and it encounters another unknowable universe called somebody else. And what do you, and I think I was spending a lot of time also thinking about right speech, and I was realizing how, for myself anyway, when can I really converse with others, or am I just sitting there kind of waiting to defend my circle of water? So when someone else is talking, for example, am I really actually curious about what they're saying, or am I a little bit measuring what they're saying about with how I see it, and a little bit getting ready to say, well, yeah, but And lately I've been playing with that, especially with my kids, because as a parent, it's hard not to fall into feeling like I've got so much to tell you about this world and but lately I've been really trying that on, this curiosity. What are you saying? How does it look to you? And I would say for me, the Sangha meeting we had a couple weeks ago was kind of a beautiful I don't know, like a bouquet of universes, like, we brought to the Sangha, okay, this big change is coming. We're going to leave the air, we're going to move, and that's going to have this huge impact. And to me, there was something really beautiful about, first of all, that everyone came forward so vulnerably. And then that how each person did was actually, a universe and another universe and another universe. And we can't control that, and that's not what we're here for. But like you're saying, like what I would say a skillful engagement is, we're here to receive. We're here to witness. We're here to be curious. We're here to be changed by one another's different perspectives. Or when we can do that, our engagement in the world is much more vital than when we're here to defend our view that's not yours, or whatever that feeling can be.
Thank you.
Is that helpful? Okay, thank you. Okay.
Dojin.
Yes. Oh, I see. Let me go on speaker. Yes.
There I am.
Hi.
Hi. Thank you for your talk.
You're welcome.
I just wanted to talk about Dogen's eyeball, because I've kind of been chewing on that. I love the mystery of Dogen's writing and how you can use it to think in a lot of different ways.
Yeah.
The thing that struck me at first, I was thinking about hiding your body in your eyeball, and I think at first I misremembered it. I was thinking about, it's putting your body in your eyeball, and then what I came back and realized, no, hiding your body in your eyeball. And so, what that was meaning to me is, well, your eyeball is your, like you said, I agree, your perception, your mind, really. And to hide your body in your eyeball means don't let your human body, or the delusion that you have a human body, hide that, and remember the truth that there is no abiding self. There is no body that's permanent. There is no body that actually stops at your body. It's connected to everything else in the world that is letting you have a body. And so, those three fundamental truths, hide your body, remember those things, use that in your understanding and your skillful views.
Yeah. Thank you. It's great, isn't it? It's just like, it's so much more fun with Dogen when I mean, I understand, and I have felt the impulse of like, I don't get it. But it's more fun when you're like, well, maybe I could. You're like, what does it mean for me? And really engage with it as the offering that it is. Yeah, our whole being in our perception. I love that he also, and our past. Our past is all there. The wholeness of our past and everything that's come before us is all there in our perception. And we take care of it when we let it all be whole together, instead of trying to make the body somewhere else besides our perception. It's complete. Like I picture it like a whole body and this giant eyeball. He does also talk about it. Dogen's eyeball use is fun and various. Okay, that good for today? Thank you very much. Let's see, I'll put the closing chant in the chat. Okay. For great Bodhisattvas, beings are numberless. impossible. I vow to end them. Dharma gates are infinite. I vow to enter them. The Buddha way is boundless. I vow to realize it. Okay.